Thank you all for coming again. So this is more or less a regular group, and our last two sessions are today and on Wednesday. And I will talk about two complementary solutions to what I'm calling the simultaneous involvement of both reason and emotion in disagreement. Right? So in the beginning, I'm going to talk about a puzzling situation where both reason and emotion are involved, and I'll talk about certain tendencies, especially the tendency to rule out the involvement of emotion. Because that seems like a good idea, and I think from Socrates onwards, philosophers have dreamt of having a rarefied kind of discussion in which only reason is involved, or something weaker but equally rationalist, that reason triumphs over emotion. That reason takes the lead. Wherever emotion is involved, reason takes the lead and emotion follows. Right? So that's what I'll be talking about this afternoon. And as I announced, I will be focusing on the principle of charity. Next time, on Wednesday, I'll be talking about the intellectual virtue of steadfastness. Okay, so let's begin. So I'll begin with this point that I've already touched on, right? Which is that it seems ideal to require exclusive focus on reason whenever there is deep and persistent disagreement about some specific topic. This seems ideal for several reasons. One is that we want to rule out certain things. We notice that whenever there is disagreement, there's a threat of illogicality, there's a threat of the use of power and manipulation and illogicality, and we want to rule that out. Also, reason seems to be a powerful tool that addresses power imbalance. So that if we exclusively focus on reason, the thinking goes, we can rule out misuse of power, because if everything is based on reason, then the position with the best reasons behind it will come out on top. Right? So some philosophers talk about the unforced force of the better argument. Right? Ruling out certain tendencies to cheat via manipulative but rhetorically effective ways. Right? So many think that rational persuasion, I define here rational persuasion as something that involves giving reasons, presenting evidence, of course, under the assumption that the evidence is good. Right? Giving good reasons, presenting good evidence, of course, there's an evaluative component, even as you present reasons and evidence, and then drawing conclusions only from these. Right? So that's the exclusive focus on reason. Right? So far, so good. Seems like a good idea. Seems to rule out things we want to rule out. It seems orderly and rational, right? What more can we want, right? But the problem is that human thought and judgment involve emotion and other non-cognitive elements. We're not reasoning machines. I think the ideal of exclusively focusing on reason would make sense. Are we reasoning machines? But we're not. We're not reasoning machines. Right? So we have this ideal that we seem to aspire to, based on what we think, what many philosophers tell us, is our higher capacity, our capacity for reason. And yet there's a reality on the ground that we're highly emotional beings. Right? Many of our judgments are driven by emotions. And I would argue that's not a bad thing. Right? It's not a bad thing. So, on the one hand, exclusive focus on reason seems like it's a good thing. On the other hand, it also seems like a bad idea to rule out emotion. Right? So I will talk about this movie that I'm hoping some of you have seen. Is there anyone who's seen? No? Anyone? No? Rocky, you've seen it?
While back.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay, right. So it's a movie from I think it says here 2013. I think it came out 2012 or something like that, right? And I'll tell the story behind the movie in a while. But this case shows us that even if you're right, even if your conclusion is right, based on good reasons and proper evidence, if you run a campaign convincing people of the truth of your conclusion without the involvement of emotion of a certain type, your conclusion won't be intractable. Right? So this is a movie about a referendum or a plebiscite in Chile. I think around 1988, if I'm not mistaken, where they were voting about continuing the Pinochet regime, right? So the director is Pablo Larraín, and he talks about this event in Chile, right? So basically, they're voting yes or no. Yes would mean another 8 years for this dictatorial regime, right? That's not very bad news. No would mean that's the end of him, we'll have a new government, right? Now, the correct conclusion seems obvious. We have a very good account of the atrocities committed by Pinochet and his men, right? And the people under him. But from an advertising standpoint, a campaign based on some people call a litany of sins of this regime, a list of all the atrocities, a list of all the bad things that the regime has done, the bad effects on the people, and this is real, it's not fabricated, this is factual, right? Well, from an advertising standpoint, from a campaign standpoint, it was dour and unappealing. It was not catching on, right? And the movie is about the story of an advertising man, played by Gael Garcia Bernal, who takes on the challenge of creating a campaign, and the campaign they create is one that's kind of almost frothy. It's about people being happy, laughing, right? What is it about? They focused on joyful future possibilities. Right? The association they created is about the kind of joyful possibility you will have if you vote no. Right? Now, this is a very interesting case because it tells you what's persuasive. And what's persuasive is not just emotion, but emotion of a certain type. Because the initial campaign also involves emotion. Right? And there is a way of looking at this in which you see what happened, you see the story as I tell it, and then you say, well, maybe it's a matter of reaching a certain conclusion through reason, and then using emotion to run a campaign. So that emotion is kind of like an icing on top. You have the foundation built by reason, and then you use emotion as a kind of packaging so that people, agree with the correct conclusion, right? I think this is a misguided way to see the story, right? And I will explain how and why that's mistaken in the coming minutes, right? Okay, so because of the simultaneous involvement of effective emotion-infused persuasion and reason in disagreement, I think we have two questions. And consistent with the theme of these lectures, I ask the questions with a practical dimension. There are many theoretical questions that we could ask. about what account of judgment fits this involvement of both reason and emotion. And a lot of ink has been spilled, so many philosophers have written about this, right? But that's not going to be our concern today. I want to focus on two questions, right? Two questions that have direct practical implications. Okay. First, now that we've seen the advantages of using reason and disagreement and the necessity of having an emotional component, one question we can ask is, how can we get the benefits from both rational argumentation and judicious modes of persuasion that involve emotions? Right? That seems to be of interest when we look at disagreements as diverse as vaccination, BJK, climate change, right? ADHD as a proper disease. And I highlight the words honestly and effectively because this is also something that we're interested in. How do we honestly and effectively combine rational argumentation with emotion-infused persuasion when we disagree with others? One question brought up by the advertising campaign, based on the Chile story, is that advertising campaigns, and we all know about this, can be manipulative. And when we engage in disagreement, we want to avoid manipulation. Indeed, this is one of the reasons the rational ideal looms large. Right? The thinking goes that rational argumentation is not manipulative. But emotion-infused persuasion, it can be. It can be manipulative in very bad ways. Right? So those are questions. I will try to answer them by discussing a case, but I'll fast forward to what my conclusion is going to be, right? Of how we can address these two questions, right? My answer is that we can adapt something called the principle of charity for heated disagreement. Okay? Some of you may have heard about the principle of charity before. It's a principle that is attributed to Quine and Davidson, and it arises in the context of radical interpretation. And when you don't know what somebody is talking from a different language, maybe the same language, but usage that's completely foreign to you. Right? At least that's the original context, but I'll not discuss the details of those texts by Quine and Davidson. What I will discuss is a specific case of heated disagreement in philosophy that I think is of special interest in itself and also of special interest to us in our context. Right? Again, I've mentioned this before. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but there was this piece that came out in the New York Times, May 2016. Are you hearing about this for the first time? Who's hearing about this for the first time? Okay, we have some hands up. So for those who have heard about it before, were you aware of it in 2016, 2017? This was like raging from that time, right? Probably not, right? This is a very provocative piece, right? Highly provocative. And I hope to show many things by telling and analyzing the case, but also, most importantly, I want to show that we can use reason to elicit and provoke very strong emotional responses, which is what this piece did, right? So basically, the idea is in the title of the op-ed. It's a very simple conditional. If philosophy won't diversify, then let's call it what it really is. Right? Which is, the proposed renaming is Department of European and American Philosophy. So, this piece, written by J. Garfield and Brian Van Norden, has been called High-Spirited, over the top, also implementing a take no prisoners approach, a take no prisoners attack against philosophy. It was highly provocative. I'm not using the word provocative for no reason, right? If you look at philosophy departments in North America, and Australia and New Zealand, and many other places in the world, in many English-speaking countries, or countries with English programs all over the world, you look at philosophy departments, and almost all classes, almost all professors specialize on thinkers who are, broadly speaking, Western, European, American. That applies to many of the philosophy departments in the Philippines also. Right? If you look at the numbers about how many people are involved and so on. Right? So they came up with this piece, and well, J. Garfield says later in a book that came out in 2017 that he and Van Norden did not expect this level of response. So there were too many comments that the New York Times had to close it because it was getting too heated. When the New York Times comment section closed, the discussion moved to different philosophy blogs. Right? So it got hosted there. It had its own Reddit thread. And it basically just, went viral, as the expression goes. Right? I don't think there was any move to actually change the name of philosophy departments. Right? That wasn't the goal, but that was the rational conclusion. Right? And we have the steps that Garfield and Van Norden go through, right? Which is a simple piece of reasoning. Like I said, it's in the conditional that you see in the title, right? So first, the vast majority of philosophy departments offer courses only on philosophy derived from Europe and the English-speaking world, right? I think the word derived is important because you may get philosophy courses that purport to be from other traditions, but actually are still derived from European and other English-speaking traditions. Right? No other humanities discipline demonstrates the systematic neglect of most of the civilizations in its domain. Therefore, for decades, some professors and students have been trying to persuade philosophy departments to broaden the canon. But these efforts have been mostly ignored. Right? So then you get the idea, if you continue to ignore this line of thinking, then just be honest and change the name of the department. Because there are some people, where is this coming from? What's the context? There's the idea when people say, oh, there's this whole tradition of Chinese philosophy and East Asian traditions, right? So we have texts, not just from China, but also traditions from Korea and Japan. We have a whole other tradition in South Asia. Okay? That's completely ignored. What's the reason that some people give? The reason that some people give is that those things are, quote-unquote, area studies. So Confucianism should be under East Asian studies, the thinking goes, or maybe Asian studies, I don't know. Right? And Indian philosophy should be under South Asian studies. Right? So really, the disagreement is about what counts as philosophy, because philosophy has a claim to universality. The idea is that if something counts as philosophy, it's relevant for all human beings. That's the conclusion. Right? So the conclusion is either fail to diversify and change the name of your department, or diversify and keep your department's name. Right? Those are the choices that they gave people. Right? Like I said, nobody was really going to change the names of the philosophy departments. And I think it's very important to point out that Van Norden and Garfield are very clear about what they want. They used a closed-knit piece of reasoning, right? That's very tightly argued. The conclusion is to change the name of departments, right? But they say, quite transparently, we believe that renaming departments would not be nearly as valuable as actually broadening the philosophical curriculum and retaining the name philosophy. Right? So that's the agenda, so to speak. That's the goal they want to attain, and it's something that they're concerned about. So, and one thing that this whole provocative piece has dug out is this idea, the quote that I have in the part of the text that I have in orange. Right? Philosophy as a discipline has a serious diversity problem. Right? And of course, the practical question is what do we do about it? What do we do about it? I'm not sure if I've mentioned it yet, but Garfield and Van Norden said initially they thought the op-ed will be met by stony silence or eyeball rolling. This, by the way, is part of the reason they deliberately took a provocative approach. And I think it's very highly instructive. When a certain issue is being ignored to the point of invisibility, like the lack of diversity in philosophy, something very provocative was needed to draw out the responses that was being concealed, if you like, by stony silence and eyeball rolling. Right? Stony silence and eyeball rolling from people from people in positions of privilege is very powerful in stopping certain discussions to come. Right? Sometimes the theme in heated disagreement is about, how do you scale down the heat, so to speak? How do you dial down the responses, right? But I think one very interesting point we're seeing from this case is sometimes, the heated reactions are necessary for drawing out the discussion of something that's actually not. In heated discussion, I think if it doesn't come too close, it's not a bad thing. If the issue is very important, I'd even argue it's a good thing. Right? The responses are coming out and being discussed and so on. Okay. At this point, do you have questions or clarifications? No? You have no questions? Okay, I have a question for you. What do you make of this disagreement? Especially those of you who are hearing about it for the first time. I saw some hands go up when I was asking about whether you're hearing about this for the first time, right? So what do you make of this? What is your response? What is your response? Yes, Rob.
One thing that came to mind was how before this was even brought up, this opinion piece was even public. It was like a well-known thing, and at least in West, that when you say philosophy, at least in the academic sense, it pertains to dead white men.
Okay.
So yeah, with beards, and I felt like another motivation for the piece was like somebody has to say it. Like everybody's just silently accepting this fact, but then let's move towards globalization and move of diversifying. I think that was one of the. I feel like that was one of the motivations for it. Like let's just come out and come clean with it.
Okay. There's something that needed to be said, and the op-ed expressed that quite nicely. Right? And once it was out there, it began to gain traction, at least in terms of discussion. Right? People were discussing this issue now. Any other responses?
Just to add to that as well, I feel like it was a good kind of catalyst for discussion because a lot of things are scientifically accepted. If we were to bring out the public eye or shed light on, a lot of people might actually have like opinions that could help further the discussion instead of like silent treatment with the eyeball on the other hand.
Okay. That there's something good came out of and by something good, we don't mean all of a sudden people started to agree and they said, okay, let's read the classics from Asia. No. That's not the good thing that came out. But the good thing that came out is that people are now talking about this, right? Any other responses to this disagreement? Okay.
What came to mind was this piece, like what Rocky said, it's everyone seemed to know it, but no one was that brave enough to actually put it forward. And so, for me as a student, well, we also recognize that there are classics from Asian thought, and there in the Philippines, like some Filipinos actually try to grapple with these Western texts and interpret it in a Filipino context way. So, but yeah, it's still Western.
Yeah.
And but to argue that it should be changed into a Western and American philosophy, I think that's where I sort of disagree, because part of the philosophy department, for example, in Asia, is reinterpreting these texts, although they're Western texts, but in the light of the current context that they're in.
Okay. That's an interesting point. The idea that whenever you have non-Westerners studying and interpreting Western texts, you get something slightly, if not a lot, different. Okay. You should probably think more about that. How it is different? Is it automatically different?
Yeah, because I don't think the texts are passively accepted as our Western text. Is it? We're gonna be Westernized. I think there's also a perspective that's put into the interpretations that something comes out.
Okay, fair enough. The interpretative stance is always coming from a certain context that you're standing in, right? And I'd like to point out that this whole idea about interpretation is itself, right, a philosophy. When you talk about the hermeneutic approach and so on, right? That's kind of what it's about, right? That you stand in your own horizon and you kind of interface with something other than you. Okay. So, fair enough, right? Also, what Kim brought up raises an important question, which is, do we get a free pass if we're operating in an Asian context? I think that's an interesting question for us, and something that's by no means easily answered. Okay, so how do you think philosophy students and professors responded to it? Well, they responded in various ways. And I will show you some of the responses, especially in terms of, initially, lack of reason and sheer illogicality, right? And also the kind of issues it raised. But then again, we're operating from the idea this was previously ignored, right? There's this very nice summary of responses provided to us by the philosopher Amy Wolverine. And I collect on this slide 3 of the most illogical. These are actual responses. In fact, the comment that Wolverine came up with is called expanding the canon. And she says, whenever somebody proposes to expand the canon, I propose you play this bingo because the responses are always like this. Right? So first, someone will simultaneously profess not to know non-Western sources and then express skepticism that those sources are philosophical. if you don't believe me that such responses actually exist, you're free to go through the responses in the New York Times comments and also in the philosophy blogs. I can give you the links if you so desire. Right? Someone will make claims along the lines of, and this is really something that comes up very often, response B, illogical response B. Right? Someone will make a claim along the lines of, I once read something in that area and it wasn't very good. Therefore, all things in that area must be also not very good. Right? And third, someone will offer incredibly condescending remarks purporting to explain what philosophy is. And well, there it is, non-Western stuff just doesn't fit. And then parenthetical, not that there's anything wrong with that. Right? This is like the equivalent of a backhanded compliment, I guess. So these responses were there even before the op-ed piece came out, but it wasn't out in the open. I think it's accurate to say that this kind of thinking was there, but nobody was expressing it. But because of this provocation that came from the column that the two people wrote, we have these responses, and we can actually see them and address them for what they are, right? Illogical responses that they are, right? Now, I want to move on to two comments because it has relevance for some of the things that we need to consider, not least the point raised by King. Right? So, two other responses. I think response E is very common among analytic philosophers. Response D is, it's patronizing, as the summary tells you. Someone will offer patronizing paths toward normality for the deviant folks studying non-Western traditions. For instance, if you could just justify yourselves to us with reference to forms and styles you find completely familiar and won't overtax us, then you could belong. Right? So this is like an attempt to make non-Western tradition fit, like Western framings. Or someone will play precision monger and take issue with some minutia in any proposed expansion and insist the change ought to stop dead in its tracks to sort out this tiny detail. Right? Now, what do all these responses have in common? They all resist the move towards diversification. They want to stop it, right? And it becomes very obvious here, right? Now, before moving to the other set of responses, another one that's compiled by Garfield, I want to point out that option B is especially interesting for people like us who belong to a non-Western tradition. Right? Because I think it's possible to revise this and phrase it in terms of normality or orthodoxy in studying a non-Western tradition. This is very obvious in studying quote-unquote Filipino philosophy. Some people argue that there's no such thing as Filipino philosophy. Some people don't argue and just go ahead and do what they call Filipino philosophy. There are people who do Filipino philosophy and then argue that this other person is saying that she's doing Filipino philosophy, but it's really not. Right? So this whole attempt to make something into a homogeneous approach, it's something not confined in the Western tradition, certainly not in Western philosophy. Right? And I think that's very important to notice. Okay, another set of responses. According to J. Garfield, some people, instead of having these responses, offer what are supposedly dumbfounding questions. I'm calling them what are supposedly dumbfounding questions, supposed to be no answers to them or just too hard to answer, right? In a quick and easy way so that, the move towards diversity will not happen, right? So one, it's too hard to cover the core, the history of philosophy. from the pre-Socratics to Plato and Aristotle to the Romans, and then the medieval scholastics, and then the early modern philosophers, and the people in the Renaissance, and all that. We need time and resources to cover that. How are we expected to cover another 1,000 years in at least 2 or 3 other places, right? There aren't just any good graduate programs training people in these areas. We don't read the languages, right? So especially in Asia, we are very conscious of this. There are very, very real language barriers, right? So it's not just that we don't read Mandarin, but we don't read the kind of Mandarin that would allow you to read the Analects or the Benzi. We lack the expertise to determine what is good and what is bad in non-Western philosophy. And the practical, what do we cut in order to do this? Who do we defund? Right? Whose office do we sequester so that we can make room for this? Right? Do you have ideas about how to answer these questions? They're supposedly dumbfounding. I don't think they're really dumbfounding. Right? So can anybody offer like a quick and easy response to at least one of these questions? Listen.
I'm thinking about these lectures and they're taking place outside, so we established the normal courses being offered by the philosophy department, but there's been regular people showing up. So, I mean, if the university has like classrooms that aren't being used for particular times, I don't think it's practical.
Okay. There are workarounds. We can find spaces. We can find people who will be doing the thing and they'll just go ahead and do it, and people will come. Yes, right? And that overrides some apparent practical difficulties. You don't read the languages. Correct me if I'm wrong, none of you are fluent in Attic Greek. But some of you use ideas from the ancient Greek philosophers. We can and do rely on translations. We lack the expertise to determine what is good and what is bad. Well, we can ask others who do know. Right? So the questions are really obstructionist. Right? They're obstructionist, I think, instead of dumbfounding. So what do we have here in this disagreement? One answer is that there's just this big chasm between Western and non-Western traditions, so that there's this big divide between these two traditions, right? And I'm taking this to be representative of non-Western. This is, of course, not the only one. This is associated with the early Confucian tradition, right? What do we make of this divide? Different worldviews, different conceptual schemes, different histories, right? Some of the people respond to the effort to draw attention to non-Western sources by saying, look, in the Chinese tradition, there's no such thing as scholarship or sustained commentary. This is completely false, right? It's not true that there's not sustained commentary, and it's not true that there's not sustained discussion of those ideas. There is, except that most people outside the tradition aren't aware of it. Right? So how do we approach this? Right? This is the juncture at which I think the principle of charity is relevant, because the principle of charity is designed for cases where people can hardly understand each other because they're fighting about the use of a term, and the allegation is one side is using it in a highly non-standard and absurd and nonsensical way, right? Which is why, if you read the text, the example in Quine's text is gabagay, when we're having difficulty in translating that into rabbit. Right? Here, the relevant term seems to be philosophy, and we're having difficulty in translating that outside Western tradition. Right? So I'll go ahead and discuss the principle of charity. This is a principle with both ethical and epistemic elements. Right? On the one hand, the principle of charity can be cashed out or can be expressed in terms of what looks like the golden rule. And that is part of its ethical dimension. The recommendation is we must interpret others' claims and arguments in the way that we want them to interpret our own claims and arguments. Right? So a kind of reciprocity, kind of demand for mutual respect. Right? Failure to do this would be disrespectful and also would not lead to a productive discussion. Right? So that's the ethical side. The other side is epistemic, and this is the original context. The principle of charity did not originally arise in discussion of ethical issues. As I said, it arose in the context of radical interpretation. Right? So the best way to understand someone and to know whether what they're saying is true is to take their claims seriously and to attribute as much consistency and truth and reference to things that you're familiar with as possible. So it's an injunction to understand another view in the best way possible, in the most rational way possible, if you like. Okay? And then this becomes a methodological commitment to focus only on the strongest or best version of a view that one disagrees with. Right? And to set aside the other versions. Okay? So this is the principle of charity, and it has several dimensions to it that I will talk about some more. First, right? We must notice that people inhabit the world like we do, in the sense that they refer to the same objects, the same phenomena. They say things that are true by our own lights. They say things they think are true. And they judge truth in the way that we judge truth. And the set of claims they put forth are consistent in ways we ourselves recognize. Right? The whole point is to optimize points of agreement between two sides. Optimize points of agreement between two sides. Right? Now, these are, in this slide, the ethical and the epistemic are flipped. So that the first point talks about the epistemic dimension of the principle of charity, and this part talks about value. This is just hinting towards value, actually, ideas from David Wong in the next two slides. Right? So the idea is, to make sense of what someone is saying, we must attribute as much sense, consistency, and meaningfulness to their utterances. This would be true if they were voting in a plebiscite, if they were saying something about the Marcoses, if they were expressing a position against vaccination, or whatever. We attribute the most consistency and coherence, the most sense that we can to their view. Because it's possible to do that, right? And that's how it becomes a methodology. It's a way of proceeding, right? So what about the domain of value? We have two ideas from Wong, who uses Davidson's principle in the domain of morality. So this is a quote from his book with the title Natural Moralities. Wong says, "To make sense of the action of others, we construe these actions as stemming from intentions, which in turn stem from certain patterns of beliefs, desires, and values. Some patterns make others intelligible to us, and others don't. However, such ways of making sense of others do not prevent us from attributing to them some desires, values, and intentions that are different from ours. For example, I accept that others want and value the having of power over people, even though the idea does not hold much appeal to me." Right? So I think it's something very important here. You attribute as much coherence and meaningfulness to what somebody else is saying, while also recognizing that what they're saying is different from what you're saying. And here, he has a very clear example. In some cases, in the domain of value, we take the same things to be valuable as someone we disagree with. Usually, we have a different ordering or ranking about which is more important in specific cases. So, at least the recognition of the common ground is something that's consistent with the principle of charity. You're attributing as much optimal point of agreement with the other side. Right? Okay. Here's another idea from Wong. And I think Wong is a very interesting philosopher to discuss about the principle. Wong is a philosopher with very useful ideas to discuss about the principle of charity, because there's a dimension of principle of charity I'm not touching on in this lecture, which is that some philosophers use the principle of charity to get rid of disagreement, or to say disagreement will eventually disappear. Once we consistently apply the principle of charity, we will see that fundamental disagreement will disappear. Right? Some people express this optimism. Wong does not. Right? But he says, even if we don't attribute to the principle of charity an almost magical quality, an almost magical power to make deep disagreements disappear, it's still useful, because at the very least, applying the principle of charity can bring about increased understanding. And I think that's why the ethical dimension of the principle of charity is very important. At the very least, if you use the principle of charity in engaging with someone you disagree with, you may not end up with a consensus, like a perfect solution where you both agree, but at the very least, you attain greater understanding of what people think exactly, why they think that, and even why they don't agree with it. So these are important pieces of information that help us understand the world we live in and other people. So we can attain epistemic goods, understanding, knowledge, even if we don't get consensus, perfect resolution to disagreement. I think that's an important point. Now, in the few minutes that I have left, I will discuss a practical way to apply the principle of charity. Right? And I will do that by going over a very nice procedure outlined by Daniel Dennett that's consistent with the principle of charity, but I think is nearly impossible to follow in a straightforward way. If any of you have been in my classes, I show this sometimes. So this is Dennett's Guide to Successful Critical Commentary. And I've seen it making the rounds on Facebook. So it's kind of common, it's been picked up by media outlets, and it's been shared a number of times. Right? So the steps would consist on first re-expressing your target or your opponent's position, right, in as clear, vivid, and fair a way as possible. Okay? And then to list points of agreement. This would be aligned with optimizing points of agreement with somebody else. Right? And you should mention anything you learned from your target, something you learned. Again, this is aligned with the attainment of epistemic goods. Then and only then are you permitted to say such a word of rebuttal, or so much a word of rebuttal or criticism. Right? Philosophers have difficulty in following this, including Dennett himself. Why is that? Is that like a moral failing? Not necessarily. Right? I would say that it's difficult, maybe even almost impossible in some cases to follow this, especially to begin with one, because of cognitive weaknesses and emotions. We always see the opponent or the target's position from a skewed perspective. And actually, the previous lectures have already shown you that, right? So I'll give you a concrete example of a cognitive illusion and how to work around it, right? Okay, let's go back to the no example, the movie. So, you heard the story. So in Chile, they were having a referendum. They were voting yes or no to Pinochet. And then, initially, people were inclined to vote yes. Let's just allow this person to continue ruling the country. Even if they've heard all those litany of sins, all the things, all the bad things committed by the regime. Okay? And then they changed tactic. They ran an ad campaign, which is very cunning because again the regime was watching them, right? And they need something that was rhetorically effective, very effective from an advertising point of view. And instead, they ran a campaign based on joy. Right? Now, what do you make of people of Chile when you hear this story? What do you make of their moral and intellectual character? When we hear a story like that, when humans, by we I mean humans, right? When humans hear a story like that, right, meaning we see a behavior, right? They were voting yes under one ad campaign. And then another ad campaign was ran and they started voting no. They started to get inclined to vote no. That's all we know about them. We don't know anything else. How do we explain this? Usually, we appeal to the character, what kind of persons they are. Maybe we'll say they're not very reasonable, they're very easily swayed by ad campaigns. Right? They're very easily manipulated by ad campaigns. That's one pattern of explanation. Right? And I think that's highly intuitive. We did run an experiment in which I asked you whether you thought this was intuitive. Right? I'm just going to go with the idea that it is, because this is a widely documented cognitive failing. There are two actual names for it. One is the fundamental attribution error, and the other is the correspondence bias. It's the tendency to infer a character trait after seeing even just one instance of behavior. Right? So you see someone do something like rescue a child from a rabid dog, and then you say that person is brave. You attribute the character trait from one instance of behavior, even if after a while you ask yourself, okay, can I really infer a character trait from one instance of behavior? No. But the fast thinking, the quick conclusion is that this is easily explained in terms of character. So here, we might be inclined to say, I think we think in this way. We use this pattern of thinking, especially when people say, oh, and I hear this quite often, the masses vote in a certain way because they're highly susceptible. You make that mean something about their intellectual and moral character. Right? But what if we change that? What if we interpret ourselves and others whom we respect when they respond more to positive emotion than negative ones? Because that's what was happening in Chile, was that. They were more responsive to positive emotion, but they were less responsive to negative emotion. All the anger, all the despondence, right? That was coming from sheer enumeration of the wrongdoings, atrocities committed under the regime, right? So if we put that in a local case, in the case of the historical revisionism of the Marcoses, right? What if people are inclined? So imagine yourself, imagine people you respect. Imagine what you would do if they are not inclined to mobilize, like go on the streets or start petitions or lobby or do something like that, when they consider all the atrocities that were committed during that regime, consider all of the accounts of all the torture and so on. Right? But they're more motivated when you start talking about how better the country will be in the future if we have the right records of what happened during that time and the correct account of what's heroic behavior and what is not, and what medals were faked, and so on, right? But also the positive possibility that will happen, right? So if you see yourself and other people acting like that, will you make that mean something bad about you in terms of intellectual and moral character? Probably not, right? Probably not. Probably you would think of this in terms of, okay, I understand that I get more motivated by a positive goal, right? That I can respond to with positive emotions, like hope for the future, like expectation of something good for the country in the next decades or something like that, right? But less responsive to the other one. If you think that, you don't make that mean something about your moral and intellectual character. This, I think, is the workaround for making application of the principle of charity possible. Being aware of cognitive weaknesses, illusions, of which we have seen several, right? And understanding how they impact us. Usually it's a good idea to apply it to yourself. And people that you are inclined to interpret compassion. The problem is sometimes we use the most uncompassionate interpretation of people with disabilities. And then why is that bad? Apart from it being morally questionable, it's also epistemically bad. Makes it difficult or impossible for us to understand what they're really saying. Right? So as a matter of strategy, this is, I think, very interesting. Okay? And what I'm proposing looks like this. Okay? Us implementing the principle of charity specifically for engaging in disagreement. And this is the adjustment of the principle of charity that I'm proposing. First, begin from the assumption, be self-critical, begin from the assumption that I may be operating under false assumptions or distorted perception of facts, especially because of confirmation bias and the kind of fast thinking that Kahneman talks about. He has that unwieldy acronym that stands for what you see is all there is. Right? So that's a narrowing of the cognitive field where you consider only options that are immediately retrievable at the moment. But usually that's a very limited set. Right? Once you operate from this assumption, right, you may begin to reconsider a set of views that's different from your own. Right? And then you can begin on the epistemic task of focusing on the epistemic goods, knowledge and understanding that are relevant to the disagreement, and the strategies that would lead to the amelioration of the distortion, etc. Right? So the ethical point begins by, you call it self-awareness, I suppose. Okay? An awareness that we operate from a set of assumptions coming from a lot of confidence in ourselves and our own views, and a lot of distrust of other people, but especially if those other people think a certain way. We usually make that mean something about their intellectual and moral character. Right? And then we focus on the epistemic goods, right? And move towards the process of charitable engagement. Okay. So I will talk about this some more, right? But right, I'm flagging this interesting article that you can check out yourself. It's an article about epistemology and what it's about. More specifically, I want to focus on this point. Right? So this is a picture from the article that I flagged. Okay. And I'll just read this part because I think it's very important. And it's the basis for adjusting the principle of charity. It's interesting that we individually tend to think of ourselves as clear thinkers and see those who disagree with us as misguided. We imagine that the impressions we have about the world come to us unsullied and unfiltered. We think that we have the capacity to see things just as they really are, and that it is others who have confused perceptions. This is a pervasive human tendency, from controversial views about anything, capital punishment, abortion, vaccination, to things so mundane as driving. People have a very high confidence on their personal ability to drive well and condemn all others as bad drivers. Those other people are bad. So usually it's overconfidence in your own position, right? And a completely uncharitable interpretation of all other people's abilities, intentions, and everything else, right? So the adjustment to the principle of charity I'm proposing is precisely directed at that, right? That's why I present a new guide adapted from there. Right? And this is what I am proposing we use in actual cases of heated disagreement. Right? First, and I've already started the discussion of this, assume that your understanding of the opposing view is influenced by cognitive weaknesses. This is true, I think, 100% of the time. We are operating in fast thinking. We are influenced by confirmation bias. We are susceptible to morally and epistemically insignificant pressures like lighting, color of the font, and things like that. If you're interested, I can show you papers that go through the experiments that show that kind of wild influence on our thinking. Right? So assume that. Assume that's true. Right? And that it undermines charitable interpretation. Right? So after acknowledging that you're influenced by cognitive weaknesses, right, the second step is to focus on attaining epistemic goods. Despite these weaknesses and illusions, you still want to attain some degree of understanding and knowledge. Right? And the way that you can do that is to list points of agreement and anything you've learned from your opponent. What beliefs, if any, do you have in common? What things do you take to be valuable even if you don't give it the same weight? Right? And after that listing, and after that account, I think that's the only point where you can begin to restate the opposing view in a way that will help you engage better. So I think I have no time to argue for the change in ordering. But I think the change in ordering is important because beginning from number one, as Dennett suggested me to, right? I think it's impossible in most cases, precisely because of the cognitive illusions and weaknesses that we see. Right? And then fourth, you express rebuttal and criticism in ways that affirm shared beliefs, values, and goals. I will talk more about this on Wednesday. Right? So that you establish, I disagree with you on this, I think you're wrong at this point, but notice that I'm interested in promoting the same thing. This is a tactic, and I think if you're transparent about it, can be very useful. Right? So, how do we apply that to the case of lack of diversity in philosophy? Right? I have several ideas that we can go over. First, if I work on mainstream Western thinkers, I should avoid any response that does not involve slow thinking in the form of learning about the traditions that I don't know anything about. Right? You remember Olberding's enumeration of responses? There's only one thing that's acceptable in there, and it's what I have here in orange. Right? So again, this is also available in the very widespread discussion of this issue. Right? Someone will offer arguments that, hey, there are good things out there, and here's a list of some. actual contemporary pieces or classic pieces or commentaries on Asian, African, Latin American traditions, right? So if you're working on mainstream Western thinkers, it's a good idea to at least look at that, right? And how and why will you look at that? Well, the motivation, I think one of the motivations would be the attainment of epistemology. Trying to get more knowledge, trying to gain greater understanding. Right? But if you work on alternative traditions, I think there's something very useful that we've learned from like acknowledging the cognitive weaknesses. If I'm right that the cognitive weaknesses get in the way of our understanding in the world and gets in the way of productive engagement in disagreement, even if you're on this side, on the side that affirms the non-Western traditions, there is an absolute imperative not to be complacent. And I think this is very important, right? If I work on alternative traditions, I'm just using alternative mainstream as the distinction because I don't want to use Western and non-Western, that's still indexed on Western thought. Then I should avoid responses that vilify opponents and get in the way of doing actual work on less commonly taught philosophy. Right? That's the acronym that that one invented. The latter especially applies to avoiding homogeneous or orthodox approaches, right? So this is what I hinted at earlier. Even as you're studying non-Western alternative sources, there's still the danger of creating pockets of homogeneity and orthodoxy that is unwelcoming and marginalizing to people with different views, which is what got us in this problem in the first place, right? So next meeting, I'm also going to talk about steadfastness and the value of having groups composed of people with different opinions. So the social dimension, if you will, of this discussion, right? Because the principle of charity is something you can only sustain if we have a community that includes people with different opinions, maybe even wildly different opinions than ours. Right? Okay. So I will talk about next week. I will end with this before I open the floor for questions. I will, well, two things. I have a summary, but also I want to go to this quote from Toni Morrison, right? Which is an important dimension of the op-ed from Garfield and Van Norden. Okay? So we can read this quote from Toni Morrison. She says, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the faculties. Someone says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one market. I think this is not true just of racism, but also all kinds of marginalizing ideologies. Sexism is an especially serious problem in philosophy. It's not just lack of diversity in terms of traditions from different parts of the world. It's also lack of diversity with regard to non-male voices, right? So the serious diversity problem of philosophy lies there too. And I think there's something very important here, and this already leads to steadfastness and disagreement. You just keep doing what you need to do. You keep on doing the work. In this case, doing the work on alternative traditions, maybe also using alternative approaches in those traditions. And I think this is the reason why Holberding was saying, I'm just going to play bingo, and then I am going to continue the scholarship on, in her case, Chinese philosophy. Right? Because it is the thing that you are promoting, the diversity that you are finding, right? And that is a steadfast approach that I will talk more about on Wednesday. Okay. Questions, comments, clarifications? Alright, you have questions?
So the charity is a way to parse through the disagreement on your part, or is it also a component of dialoguing with the party you're actually disagreeing with?
It is both, right? Why was I putting a lot of emphasis on the charity being an adjustment on the part of the agent? One quick answer is that's the part that we control. And insisting that the other person be charitable, you can insist on that as much as you want. But the one whose charity is within your control is you. And we are evolved towards tit for tat mentality, in which if you show charity and you show a willingness to listen, that's usually reciprocated, or at least people are trying to behave in a similar fashion. Okay? So it has that function for engaging with others, but I was focusing on what you can, on what the agent can do, because that's what we control.
Well, along with Carl's comment, what if you're found in a situation in that disagreement with the party, and you've been exercising this physical charity, but you can at one point you can reliably see that there is nothing constructive going on at that moment. So what can you do as an agent to either, how do you approach the situation now, seeing as though you're not getting anywhere with what's happening?
Okay. I think my suggestion to focus on epistemic goods and the epistemic ends of engagement is important, right? Seeing that you're not gaining further understanding, you're not getting more knowledge from this exchange. Instead, what you may be getting is more tension, heated emotional responses. In this case, it's a practical strategy to walk away for the moment, pending further decision on whether you will walk away from this particular engagement, or you will try to pursue the epistemic goods, which is greater knowledge and greater understanding outside this context. So I think it's very important. Actually, no, right here, something I skipped over quickly. As we were running out of time, right? I think I'm. Okay, clear. So we recognize that we operate on distorted perception, etc. Right? Also, right? One problem is that sometimes you're inclined to think in terms of a zero-sum triumph over our opponent, and I think this might be close to what you're describing. You're both just trying to win and score points over the other person. Can become like that, especially in a politicized discussion. I mean, politicized in a bad way, where you're running after, I don't know, opinion polls and shares or like engagement of a certain kind in social media, right? Then in that sense, you're no longer engaged in trying to gain better understanding. You're just interested in trying to triumph over your opponent, score points and so on. Right? Which is, I think, an advantage to focusing on the epistemic goods.
Is it possible to apply the principle of charity to potential disagreements? Like, for example, as teachers, we can voice certain opinions and has to automatically silence differing opinions from students, and they're not likely to disagree with you if you already say upfront that this is my opinion. So I'm thinking specifically of disagreements about martial law. While you're not necessarily open to revisiting your opinion that the martial law should be condemned, you don't necessarily want to side with students who think different words or still trying to come to terms with their
Okay, yeah, sure. In this case, I think we might have just a terminological adjustment, because I suppose we could say that you're being charitable about the possibility that your students will reach a certain conclusion by themselves, but in the meantime you allow them space and the freedom to express their opinions. So in that sense, it's a methodological commitment to allow them to explore certain avenues of thought. But I think more than just applying the principle of charity, it would be a kind of effort to create the protected space within a classroom so that people can express their views and think through them in what is hopefully a safe and non-toxic environment. I think this is very critical you mentioned the case of martial law. I think this is very critical in the case of approval or disapproval of Duterte. The opinion polls indicate that there's high approval for the president, high approval across certain socioeconomic groups, which directly feeds into the Ateneo, but also Ateneo has this reputation for having this completely opposed opinion of President Duterte. So you kind of wonder where the voices are expressing those opinions. It's not happening in classrooms. There's no heated disagreement in classrooms about this. But a critical question would be, is it because there are no safe spaces where people feel, especially students, with respect to teachers who will judge them, where students feel that they can express their opinion and not be judged? So I think that's a very interesting way. I think there's a separate question. There's one question of how do you handle yourself in heated disagreement, right? And there's a separate question of, well, if you're in a position where you can control things, like if you're a teacher inside a classroom, or other situations, you're in an organization or whatever, right? How can you make it possible that heated discussion of certain opinions are given space to run their course in what is hopefully a productive way that doesn't close certain avenues of expression and disallow certain opinions to be expressed? So I think this is one other dimension of heated disagreement. Admittedly, something that we have not touched on a lot in the lecture so far, but I think some of the things that I said today are relevant for it. Any more questions? Any questions? Yes?
I'd like to go back to the whole issue of dividing between Eastern and Western philosophy. Is there a different way in which Eastern traditions actually do philosophy apart from providing books and journal articles that you usually find in Western traditions?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Quick answer is yes, but it's complicated. And let me just unpack that. While it's true that the divide between Western and non-Western traditions is artificial. I'll give you a concrete example. There's a nice book called The Bloomsbury Handbook to Chinese Philosophy Methodologies, and it's a rather thick book, and it just goes through so many methodologies of studying, in this case, just Chinese philosophy. And you can imagine you can multiply that in different traditions, right? So even with approaching a certain non-Western tradition, there's a great variety. And I'm sure that that book does not exhaust all the possible approaches, right? Now, is there a distinct way that that non-Western traditions or non-Western thought bring to the table that's not there in Western philosophy? Well, yes. The two other concrete cases I can give is that, well, there's empirical evidence for both, right? So you can look at, for instance, the intuitions that people have about claims, whether somebody knows, like in get yay cases, right? To offer a very specialized topic in epistemology, right? Like whether a person says, I know, what's the example? I know this is a fake barn, right? So as opposed to, I know this is a barn, but it's false because for some reason. It appears that the way people interpret this across cultures, right? So there is so if we start exploring that in a way that's empirically grounded, and people are doing this, like it's not just going to start because we said it's going to start, right? We see a lot of interesting points, right? The other thing is something connected to something called holistic cognition, which is a pattern of thinking observed in a robust way. It's a pattern of thinking that's been robustly observed among East Asians. And I suspect if we try that out in the Philippines, we'll find something similar, right? So holistic cognition is about the tendency to think about a broad field. So the rather simplistic example is that if you have American subjects and you show them an aquarium, their eyes will focus on the biggest fish. And when you have these Asian subjects, they usually tend to focus on relations in the whole thing, in the whole field. That will have very serious implications for metaphysics and epistemology. And you can actually see the difference in perspective. I'm giving certain examples of areas of non-Western thought, of alternative traditions that I'm more familiar with. I'm sure we can multiply patterns if we find better informed individuals, right? But if we look at the way the Chinese philosophers construe philosophical theorizing, or even if they distinguish that from being like a civic and sensible human being in the cosmos, right? They certainly view that very differently compared to classical Western thinkers. Okay.
Would there be different forms of doing philosophy? And take a look at some the way we do philosophy now is mostly just like it's a form of philosophy, and then mostly. So is there a kind of different way of expressing philosophy and Eastern tradition, and we just cannot do it the same?
First of all, I want to correct that a bit. I think that there are two ways that people who are professionals in philosophy work. One is by writing, and I hesitate about the dismissive just journal articles, right? Because I don't think that there's a just involved. The second activity is teaching. So the pedagogical side is very important. And this is an area, I think, where there are interesting questions about mainstream and alternative sources. And part of the reason I have been very careful and very wary about just saying, oh, if you're in an alternative tradition, that means we've succeeded in diversifying, right? The pedagogical strategy and the pedagogical approaches in non-Western sources is sometimes set up such that opinions of the sort that Dana brought up, and even alternative opinions, is less welcome. Just because the the view from the individual, like the model of a sage understood in a certain way, with respect to a student studying under the sage, again understood in a certain way, that would have very serious implications for practice in the classroom, both in the classroom and in writing. Yeah, I mean, whether the writing in journals is challenged, and so on. Okay, so I think we have reached the end of our discussion. So thank you for coming, and see you again on Wednesday. Wednesday is going to be our last session. Okay, thank you.